Settle in and let your breathing slow, the kind of slow that makes the room feel bigger. Outside, you can almost hear water moving in the dark, patient and repetitive, like it has nowhere else to be. You're walking a quiet beach at dawn, shoes sinking gently into cool sand. Ahead, a man rests against a seawall, dressed too neatly for the hour, polished shoes, a tidy suit, a face turned toward the open sky. At first glance, it looks peaceful, even ordinary. But calm scenes can lie, and they lie best when they look finished. Tonight, with the Sleepless Detective keeping you company, you'll drift through the unsolved mystery of the Somerton Man and a few other quiet cases that refuse to explain themselves. You step closer, and you realize the first lie is the posture. He is sitting like someone taking a break, but he is too still. His head is tilted back just enough to catch the pale light. His legs are stretched out, ankles crossed, like a man who knows exactly how much space he is allowed to take up in the world. You think this is a drunk sleeping it off. You think you will clear your throat, and he will blink at you, annoyed. Wrong. The air around him has that quiet weight it gets when there is nothing left to negotiate. This is Somerton Beach in Adelaide, South Australia. It is early December in the late 1940s, which means the morning should already be warming up. But the sand still holds the night's coolness, and the seawall holds the man like a piece of furniture nobody bothered to move. The first people to notice him in the real story were ordinary witnesses, not prophets, not heroes, just locals moving through the edge of their day. They described him as well-dressed, tidy, and strangely placed, as if he had been set there on purpose. And that is the first uncomfortable detail you collect, like a small stone in your pocket. People in trouble rarely choose a formal suit for a beach. People meeting someone might. People trying to look respectable might. Or people who have nothing left might put on the last good thing they own, just to leave a clean impression. You look at his shoes again, polished, not sandy, not scuffed the way you would expect if he had wandered down here for hours. His clothes look cared for, even the way he leans, the way his shoulders settle against the wall, suggests he arrived with intention. The tide keeps doing what tides do, but gulls keep their distance. And you, unlucky enough to be the one looking closely, begin to notice the small choices that make this scene feel curated. His pockets, for example, they do not bulge with the usual clutter. No obvious wallet corner, no loose change printing circles through fabric. He is not dressed like a man who lost his way. He is dressed like a man who dressed himself carefully, checked his reflection, and then came here anyway. You call it in because that is what you do when a peaceful picture refuses to blink. And when the uniformed officers arrive, they do not rush like they do in films. They move with that slow, measuring caution, the kind that says, "We have seen bodies before, and the world did not end." They check for signs of violence. There is no blood on the sand. No obvious injury, no dramatic struggle marks. The man's face is calm, almost bored by the whole thing. That calm is not comforting. It is unsettling because it suggests either a very quiet death or a death arranged to look quiet. You start building the first version of the story because your mind hates empty spaces. Maybe he had a heart attack. Maybe he drank something he should not have. Maybe he took something on purpose. But the problem is, the details do not help you pick one. Witnesses later will say they saw him the night before. One couple noticed him propped against the seawall, as if he had been there a while. They thought they saw him move an arm, a small gesture, like swatting at a fly. Another person thought he was simply asleep. No one thought, at that moment, that they were watching the beginning of a famous question mark. And that is how mysteries survive, not on fireworks, but on normal people deciding not to interrupt a quiet scene. When the body is examined more carefully, the man's appearance stays stubbornly ordinary. He is around middle age, neatly groomed, with a kind of plain handsomeness that does not catch your eye in a crowd. The sort of face you could pass in a train station and never remember, unless you were told later it mattered. You watch the investigators do what investigators always do. They take the scene apart gently. They note the position of the legs, the angle of the head, the way the cigarette might have been placed, or dropped, or never lit at all. They look for sand in the cuffs, for salt spray on the lapels. The beach gives up almost nothing. It never does. Sand is a terrible witness. It shifts, it covers, it forgets. But the man's clothing keeps insisting on the same odd theme: care. A pressed suit, a collared shirt, a tie of all things, at the edge of the sea. It is as if he wanted to be found looking respectable, or as if he never expected to be found at all, and simply did not know how to dress any other way. You think you are looking at tragedy, and you are, but you are also looking at routine, because when the body is taken away, the beach immediately becomes a beach again. People walk past the seawall later, and the world keeps its schedule. In the clinical light of a mortuary, the calm becomes harder to trust. The pathologist does what pathologists do. They look for the body's quiet arguments: bruising, broken skin, needle marks, anything that says this was done to him. But the evidence, early on, is not generous. There is no clear cause of death that leaps up and announces itself. And you learn, in cases like this, that uncertainty is not rare. It is just rarely interesting to the public. Sometimes a body does not cooperate. Sometimes death is a locked door and you do not have the right key, or the right time, or the right lab technique. In the late 1940s, you have fewer keys than you would like. The man's stomach contents are examined. His organs are inspected. There are signs that point, softly, toward poisoning. But poison is a slippery category. Some toxins vanish quickly. Some leave hints that can be mistaken for illness. And some sit in the body like a secret, refusing to say their name. You imagine the investigators, tired already, filling out forms with ink that bleeds slightly into cheap paper. You imagine the clack of typewriters, the smell of disinfectant, the careful, dull labor of describing a dead man's clothing in exact terms, because that is what this first chapter is, really. Inventory, measurement, calm statements in official language, trying to pin down something that keeps slipping sideways. He is found without obvious identification, no wallet with a name, no letter in a pocket, no card that says, "If found, please call this person." And when you hear that, you feel the mystery begin to assemble itself, not as a dramatic twist, but as a slow refusal. A man has arrived on a beach dressed like he has somewhere to be, and he has brought nothing that says who he is. That is not impossible. People lose wallets. People get robbed. People travel light. But then you remember those polished shoes, that tidy suit. It keeps bothering you. He does not look like someone who was rummaged through and left in the sand. He looks like someone who arrived with his pockets already decided. And the witnesses, bless their sleepy honesty, keep repeating the same theme. He seemed unhurried. He seemed fine. He seemed like he belonged to a different hour. You start to wonder about the last moments, because you always do. If he was poisoned, did he know? Did he sit here because he wanted the water in front of him? Did he wait for something, for someone, for the world to change its mind? Or did he simply stop, mid-plan, mid-walk, mid-thought? And that was it. Congratulations. You have entered the part of the case where the quiet is the loudest thing in the room. Because the Shoreline scene is not chaotic, it is composed, and composition in crime usually means someone made choices. The question is whether the dead man made them or whether somebody else did. The police begin with the obvious. They check missing persons reports. They compare descriptions. They circulate photographs. They ask around. Adelaide is not a tiny town, but it is not an endless city either. Someone should recognize him. Someone should say, "That's my coworker, that's my neighbor, that's the man who always orders tea and never tips." But recognition does not come quickly. It comes in half steps, in almosts. People look at the photo and feel the tug of familiarity. Then it slides away, like trying to remember a dream by morning. And that is how your first 12 minutes with this story feel. Like watching a fog roll in, not out. Like watching a case try to be simple and fail by being too neatly arranged. You return to the beach in your mind because that is where it began. You picture the seawall, the line where sand meets stone, the small theater of a man sitting with his head back as if listening to the ocean explain something. The thing is, beaches are public. Anyone could have walked past. Anyone could have stopped. The fact that he was seen and still left there overnight is not negligence. It is human nature. People are reluctant to interfere with a scene that looks finished. People are polite to stillness. And now you have a body on paper, a photograph on a desk, and a quiet list of personal effects waiting to be cataloged. And once the beach quiet is behind you, you follow the simplest next step, what was in his pockets and what it was trying not to say. They lay the items out the way they always do, not with drama, but with order. Pockets emptied onto a table, objects separated so they can be described, tagged, and stored. At first, it looks like nothing. Just the dull, ordinary clutter of a man who left the house and did not plan to come back late. A comb, a packet of cigarettes, small coins, a ticket, the sort of thing you could find on a dresser or in a glove compartment or wedged in the corner of an old coat. But you stare longer and the normality starts to feel staged, like a room that is too clean, like a hotel bedspread pulled tight to hide the wrinkles underneath. There is a cigarette packet, for example, but it contains a different brand of cigarettes than the label suggests. It is a small trick, a little substitution, a man making do with what he has, or a man who does not want you to know what he actually bought. There are matches. There are bits of paper. There is a bus ticket, unused, from the city to a beach area. There is also, depending on which inventory you read, a train ticket, second class, from Adelaide to Henley Beach, another seaside suburb. Small movements, small plans, a little trail of transit that says he was in the area and he had intended to go somewhere. And then you notice the other theme, the one that makes investigators sit up straighter, even if they pretend not to. Labels are missing, not metaphorically. Literally, clothing tags are cut out, manufacturer labels removed, names erased from the inside seams where a tailor might have left a mark. It is the kind of effort that takes time and a pair of scissors and a certain mindset. Some people do this for comfort. Tags itch. Some people do it for poverty, cutting and repairing clothes until labels are meaningless. But this man's clothes are not poor. They are well kept. The tailoring is decent. The shoes are polished. So you are left with the uncomfortable explanation: someone did not want the clothing traced. Someone did not want a shop assistant to say, "Yes, I sold that suit last month. He wore it out of here. Congratulations." The quiet man on the beach is turning into someone who planned his anonymity, stitch by stitch. You learn, softly, how police try to build a personality from objects. It is not psychic work. It is boring, practical inference. A comb suggests grooming habits. Cigarettes suggest a taste, a budget, a routine. A ticket suggests a timeline. A key suggests a home. A receipt suggests a store, a street, a day. But here, the objects are stingy. They give you just enough to imagine a life and not enough to pin it down. The comb is a specific style, the kind that might be used for a certain hair type. The cigarettes, in their swapped packet, hint at either preference or concealment. There is no wallet, no identification, no letter. And the more you list what is present, the louder the absence becomes. No car keys, no house keys, no diary, no photograph folded soft from being opened too often, no wedding ring, no note with a phone number scribbled in a hurry. You can almost feel the detectives in that era leaning back in their chairs the way you do when paperwork starts to look like a wall. They will check hotels, they will check boarding houses, they will ask around train stations, they will send descriptions to other states. They will do all the steps that take time and pay poorly in certainty. There is a particular kind of tiredness that comes with a body that will not introduce itself. In your line of work, you get used to names. Names are handles. Names let you lift a case and carry it somewhere. Without a name, everything is heavier. The police searches clothing more carefully because when a person is anonymous, you start suspecting they are hiding something. They examine seams. They check inside cuffs. They look for tucked notes, hidden pockets, anything. And they do find something later that will become the famous hinge of the entire story. But you are not there yet. Right now, you are still in the stage where the pockets look ordinary, but not honest. You consider the ticket again, unused. It suggests he bought it and then did not take that ride. Or he took a different ride. Or the ticket belonged to someone else. Each possibility is small, but each possibility branches like a crack spreading in glass. Then there are the coins. Small change, enough for a bus, a newspaper, maybe a cup of tea. Not enough to say he was flush with cash. Not enough to say he was broke. Just enough to be irritating. And the cigarette situation is its own little miniature mystery. A packet labeled one brand, but filled with another. It could be as simple as a man reusing a packet because he liked the feel of it, or because he did not want to waste it. It could be as simple as a friend offering him cigarettes and him slipping them into the nearest container. Or It could be a sign of misdirection, a tiny disguise. In investigations, you learn not to fall in love with the clever version. Clever versions are seductive. They make you feel like the story has an author. Sometimes it does. Sometimes it is just clutter and coincidence wearing a good suit. But the removed labels are harder to dismiss. That is effort. That is intention. Someone took time to unname him. You picture him in a rented room somewhere late at night, carefully cutting tags by lamplight. Snip, snip, the sound small but final. You picture the tags dropped into a bin, or burned, or carried away. You picture him smoothing the fabric afterward, still neat, still composed. The truth is, you can make anonymity for many reasons. You can do it because you are ashamed, because you are running, because you are involved in something you should not be, because you want to spare someone else the trouble, or because you are about to do something irreversible and you want the world to struggle for a while before it understands. The officers and investigators try the basic next step. They check the items for prints, for marks, for any identifier that survived. Fingerprinting exists, but it depends on having something to compare to. In that era, databases are not the smooth, instant thing people imagine now. They are physical records, filed, stored, and shared slowly. Meanwhile, the news catches the scent of strangeness. A well-dressed man, unknown, found dead on a beach. It has everything a headline likes: mystery, respectability, no easy villain, no easy motive, but you keep your focus where it belongs, on the objects themselves, because objects do not gossip. They do not exaggerate. They just sit there, dumb and stubborn, waiting for someone to ask the right question. And the question you start asking as you stare at those empty pockets on paper is this: if someone wanted to disappear, why leave themselves on a public beach? If someone wanted to be found, why remove the labels? If someone wanted peace, why make the story so loud? You go back to the clothing details, because clothing is often the only biography a dead body offers. The suit, the shirt, the tie, all speak in a quiet accent. The tailoring suggests he may have been physically active, broad-shouldered, not frail. The shoes suggest he cared about appearance, or at least about habit. There is something else too, something that can sound small until you consider it properly. The way the clothes fit, the way they are worn, can hint at class, occupation. A manual laborer in a suit often looks like a manual laborer in a suit. A clerk looks like a clerk. A sailor looks like a sailor, even when he tries to look like a businessman. But the Somerton Man refuses to settle into a category. He looks like he could be anyone, which, again, is either coincidence or design. Police take the items, tag them, store them. The evidence room is never romantic. It smells like dust and paper, and sometimes old leather. It is a place full of half stories. And in this half story, the loudest clue is what has been erased. The missing labels, the missing address. You keep turning the idea over in your mind, the way you turn a pebble in your fingers. Some people erase themselves because they believe they are doing the world a favor. Some people do it because they are frightened. Some do it because they are trained. Trained is a word that makes everyone's spine straighten, because trained implies an organization, a job, a habit of secrecy. In the late 1940s, with war still a recent memory, people are ready to believe in spies. It is an easy costume to hang on a man who will not speak for himself. But you remind yourself gently that the simplest explanation is often the least satisfying. Removed labels can be vanity. A swapped cigarette packet can be nothing. A beach can be a place where people go to die quietly. Still, you cannot ignore the sense of tidiness, the sense that the man was not simply lost, but arranged. And when the objects will not speak, you do what detectives always do. You look for a name, even if it is hiding. They take his fingerprints, because that is standard, even if it feels like writing into the wind. Ink on skin, pressed onto cards, rolled carefully, each ridge pattern captured. Fingerprints are intimate in a way. A map of touch, a record of every small contact your hands have ever made possible. Those prints are sent, compared, checked against local files, then broader ones. In that era, the process is slow. Paper travels, requests are made, answers arrive days later, sometimes weeks. And while that happens, you watch another routine unfold. Photographs are taken. The man's face is documented from angles meant to be unflinching. His clothing is described, his height, his build, his features. Everything that might jog someone's memory is reduced to a list. There is a particular cruelty in that reduction. You become a body, then a description, then a file. If you are lucky, someone reads the file and says your name out loud. The police publish images, hoping someone will recognize him. This is the part where, in other cases, a friend calls in. A sister, a coworker. Someone says, "That looks like him. He has been missing since Tuesday." But here, the calls are soft and uncertain. People say, "It might be. It could be. He resembles someone I once knew." They bring in men to look, people who have lost someone, or who think they have. These meetings are always strange. A person stands over a dead stranger and tries to force recognition onto a face that will never respond. And sometimes, they almost do. You hear about the near recognitions? The people who come close then shake their head. The ones who say, "The chin is wrong, the ears are wrong, the feeling is wrong." They walk away with a small, haunted look, because even a near match reminds you how fragile identity can be. You can feel the weight of the unnamed body settling into the station. Detectives talk about him in the shorthand way people talk about burdens. The beach man, the unknown male, the Somerton case. The longer he goes unnamed, the more he becomes a question rather than a person. And questions attract theories the way porch lights attract moths. But before the theories come, you watch the ordinary struggle. Police check missing persons lists across Australia. They check ships. They check military records because men travel and war reshuffles identities. They check hospitals. They check prisons. They check workplaces that might notice a man not showing up. Each check has a human behind it, a clerk, an officer, someone flipping through pages, eyes dry from fluorescent light, saying, "No, not him. No, not him." The file grows. The certainty does not. Time becomes a fog, just as it always does. Witnesses forget small details. A man who looked tidy becomes a man who looked foreign, or sick, or angry, depending on who is remembering. The beach becomes more myth than place, and in the middle of it, you keep returning to the same stubborn fact. Someone had a name for him. He was not born anonymous. He did not speak in question marks. Somewhere, at some point, someone said his name to get his attention. Someone wrote it on a form. Someone might still be waiting for him to come home, or might have learned long ago how to live without answers. You sit with that thought because it is the human pivot that makes this case quietly brutal. Not the death itself, which may have been swift. Not the beach, which is indifferent. But the idea of a person reduced to an unsolved label, and as the days pass, the body is prepared for burial, because the world does not pause forever. There are procedures and costs and the dull march of necessity. If no one claims him, the state must decide what to do with him. So they preserve what they can, they take casts, they keep clothing, they store the personal effects, they document the face, they keep the fingerprints, even if they feel like they are filing away a ghost. In some versions of this story, you hear the detail that his physical features were unusual in small ways. Strong calves, perhaps, or feet that suggested he wore certain kinds of shoes often. Details like that become their own little cottage industry of speculation later. But for now, you keep the tone steady. You keep it simple. A man was found dead on Somerton Beach. His pockets held ordinary things. His labels were removed. His name was missing, and the machinery of identification, slow and methodical, began turning without catching. And then, while you are focused on the big question, who is he? A single small thing appears, almost nothing. The kind of detail you could miss if you blinked, or if you were too tired, or if you assumed the case would behave like other cases. But then, a single small thing, almost nothing, pulls the whole case into a stranger direction. It shows up the way the best complications always do, not with a bang, but with a pause. You are in the quiet, fluorescent afterlife of the case now, the examination room where everything is clean enough to feel dishonest. A man's clothes are folded, his pockets turned inside out, his seams inspected like they might confess if you stare hard enough. Somebody runs fingers along the inside of the trousers and feels something that does not belong. Not a weapon, not money, a little roll of paper tucked into a place you would not casually check unless you had already decided this man was hiding something. You ease it out, careful as if it might crumble. It is thin, torn cleanly, like it came from a page that had been waiting to be ripped. 2 words, tamam shud. You say it once in your mind, and it sits there like a stone on the tongue. It is not English. It is not a name. It is not an address. Congratulations, you have just found the kind of clue that makes people stop being normal about a case. Because 2 strange words are a doorway, and you can already hear the world lining up to walk through it, carrying flashlights, theories, and that hungry look people get when mystery feels like entertainment. But you do not get to be entertained yet. You have to do the boring part first. You have to treat the scrap like evidence, not poetry. You bag it. You label it. You record exactly where it was found. You note the placement, because placement is a kind of language. And you ask the first question that matters. What is it, and where did it come from? Tamam shud turns out to be Persian. The phrase means finished, or ended, or, depending on how you translate the mood of it, done. It is a phrase traditionally printed at the end of a book called The Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, a collection of quatrains that has been translated and retranslated until it became, for some readers, less a book and more a vibe. philosophy for people who like the taste of melancholy. Mortality served with a little sugar. The phrase is often the last thing on the last page. A closing curtain. A quiet, formal way of saying, that is all. So now you have an unknown man dead on a beach, and inside his clothes, a message that reads, in effect, finished. You feel how easy it would be to jump straight to the dramatic conclusion. Suicide note, final statement, a man marking his own exit with a literary flourish. But you have done this too long to trust the first obvious story. The obvious story is usually what somebody wants you to believe, including the part of your own brain that hates ambiguity. You look again at the body in your memory, at the neat suit and the calm face. You remember there were no clear signs of violence. You remember the possibility of poisoning floating there like a bad smell you cannot quite locate. Finished could mean he chose it. Finished could also mean someone else did. And finished could mean nothing at all. A scrap of paper stuck to fabric. A bit of litter carried by wind and coincidence. The problem is, everything about this man already feels curated. So even coincidence starts to look like intention. You watch the investigation pivot. It is subtle, but real. Before the scrap, this was a nameless death with odd pockets. After the scrap, this is a story with a quote, and quotes are sticky. They get repeated. They get whispered late at night by people who want the world to have secret meanings. The police, to their credit, try to keep it unromantic. They send the phrase to language experts. They confirm the origin. They ask around libraries and bookstores. They talk to people who might recognize the words or the habit of carrying such a phrase. And then they do something that sounds simple until you realize how many hours it chews up. They look for the book because a torn scrap does not exist by itself. It came from somewhere, and if you find the source, you find a trail, fingerprints, handwriting, a place of purchase, a person who owned it, a person who gave it away. So you go hunting for a rubaiyat, not just any rubaiyat, the exact edition that had that exact phrase printed in that exact style on that exact kind of paper. The torn edge matters. The print matters. The spacing matters. In a world of mass printing, tiny differences become a kind of map. And while you are doing that, the case keeps being the case. The body still has no name. The fingerprints still do not match. People still come in, squint at photographs, and walk away with less certainty than they arrived with. But now you have a new object for the evidence table, a scrap that says, finished. It would be funny if it were not so grim how quickly humans fall in love with symbolism. A dead man, a beach, a foreign phrase that reads like a closing line. It is practically begging to be turned into a story with a neat ending. Real life does not do neat endings. Real life does paperwork. So you watch the paperwork pile up. The scrap becomes a headline detail. Reporters mention it with a little thrill in their tone. People who have never held a body bag in their life start saying the word like they own it. Tamam shud. Meanwhile, in a quieter corner of the world, the practical work continues. Someone compares the paper to editions of the Rubaiyat. Someone checks printing houses. Someone asks if any local shops sold that book recently. Weeks pass like this, slow and annoying. Then, as it often happens, the break comes from a place that feels almost accidental. A man steps forward, ordinary citizen, mildly uncomfortable to be involved. He says something like, "I found a book in my car." You can hear the detectives' hearts do that tiny, restrained leap. Not excitement, exactly. More like something to do that might matter. The story goes that this man had parked his car near Somerton Beach. After the body was found and the news spread, he later noticed a book tossed into the back seat, or left there, or somehow present in a way he could not quite explain. The book was the Rubaiyat, and the last page was missing. Not all editions are equal. Some have different layouts, different paper stock, different fonts. But this one had the right kind of ending, the right kind of phrase, and the right kind of empty space where a page had been torn out. You hold the idea gently because it is easy to crush it with certainty. You cannot prove from a distance every step of how it got there. You cannot swear the book belonged to the dead man, but you can say the police treated it as a likely connection. And you can understand why. Because now the scrap has a plausible home. A book, a real, physical object, something you can dust, measure, and photograph. And when you have a book, you have more than paper. You have margins. You have pages that might have been marked. You have the possibility of handwriting, the most human kind of evidence there is, because it is someone's thoughts leaving tracks. So you open the back cover, and you find the other famous hinge of the case. Not a confession, not a name, a code. It is written in letters, grouped in lines, not words exactly, more like clusters. The kind of thing a bored person might scribble or a careful person might record, depending on how dramatic you feel like being. You do not get to be dramatic. You have to be accurate. The code looks like this in concept: rows of capital letters, some crossed out, some separated into groups. No obvious pattern that leaps out and introduces itself. You stare at it the way you stare at a lock you do not have the key for. You can feel your brain reaching for familiar shapes, acronyms, initials, a substitution cipher, a mnemonic, the first letters of lines from the book, a shopping list disguised to feel clever. And this is where the case becomes a kind of mirror for whoever is looking at it. If you believe in espionage, you see a spy code. If you believe in romance, you see a private message between lovers. If you believe in mental illness, you see compulsive scribbling. And if you have spent too many nights in evidence rooms, you see something more irritating, a thing that might be meaningful or might be meaningless, and you will not know which until you waste a lot of time. Congratulations, you have just met the main emotion of investigation: irritation. Because the public thinks detectives solve cases with epiphanies. In reality, you solve cases by losing sleep over things that may not matter. The police bring in people who know about codes, military types, academics, whoever can be found. They photograph the letters, they make copies, they ask for opinions, they send it around. No one gives them a clean solution. No one says, here is the message, here is the name, here is the motive. Instead, they get what you always get with unsolved ciphers: a pile of possibilities, each one confident, each one fragile. One person says it could be the initial letters of words, maybe a poem, maybe a prayer. Another says it could be a one-time pad, the kind of cipher method that needs a matching key. Without the key, it is just noise in a trench coat. Someone suggests it is shorthand for horse racing bets, or gambling, or a list of appointments. And then, because humans cannot help themselves, someone says the word spy again. The late 1940s were a time when the world still smelled like war, and the Cold War was warming up like an engine in the dark. People wanted secret agents because secret agents made the chaos feel organized. You, standing there in the dim light of the evidence room, do not get that luxury. You know that most crimes are not clever. Most crimes are simple and messy and committed by people who believe rules apply to other people. If this man was poisoned, the poisoner probably did not do it with cinematic finesse. They did it because they thought they could get away with it, and because the body could not argue. Still, the letters sit there, and they refuse to be dismissed. The book itself is odd. It is an unusual edition, not a cheap common copy. That matters a little. Not enough to convict anyone, but enough to suggest a person with either taste or access. You consider that. A man with taste. A man with access. A man who ends up dead in a suit on a beach. And then you remember the missing labels again. The swapped cigarettes. The way the scene looked arranged. It is like the case keeps nudging you in the ribs and saying, "Come on, you know this is not ordinary." But your job is to resist nudges. Your job is to keep asking what can be proven. So, what can be proven? There was a scrap of paper with Tamam Shud. The phrase matches the ending of the rubaiyat. A rubaiyat was found in a car, missing its last page and containing letters written in the back. The rest is interpretation. Now, you follow the interpretation carefully, the way you follow a stranger through a dark hallway. You do not let them lead you too far without checking the exits. The police also find, in association with the book, something else that makes the case feel suddenly domestic. A phone number, not inside the dead man's pockets, not written on an official document, written in the book or associated with the book, leading to a woman living in Adelaide. A real person with a real address. Not a code, not a phrase, not an anonymous beach. A doorstep. And the moment you have a doorstep, the case changes temperature, because doors lead to lives. Lives lead to motives. Motives lead to names. You drive there in your mind because you are the detective in this story, whether you asked for it or not. It is a quiet neighborhood, the kind of street where people water plants and pretend the world is not full of strange endings. The house is not dramatic. It does not have thunderclouds hovering above it. It is just a house, which is the most unsettling kind, because ordinary houses hold extraordinary secrets without even trying. You knock, you introduce yourself, you watch the woman's face as you say why you are there. This is where the story has to stay gentle, because real people live here, and real people had their lives tangled in public speculation for decades. The woman is often referred to by a nickname in retellings, but she was a person with a name and a life. She had worked as a nurse. She had given a copy of the rubaiyat to someone in her past, according to reports. She had connections, like anyone does, that could be innocent or important, depending on how badly you want to plot. When police spoke to her, accounts say she reacted with a kind of contained shock, not a melodramatic faint, not a cinematic confession, more like the human thing. A face that tightens, a voice that changes texture, a moment where the air in the room goes thin. You have seen that look before. It can mean grief, it can mean recognition, it can mean fear, it can mean, I do not want to be involved in this. And that last one is common. People do not want to be involved in death, even when they are. The police show her the plaster bust, or the photograph depending on the moment in the timeline. They ask the question that always feels rude, even when it is necessary. Do you know this man? The woman says no. Or she says she cannot identify him. Or she says she does not know him. But the reports later keep repeating the same troubling detail. She seemed affected, unusually so. And now you are in that familiar swamp of interpretation again, where facts are simple and human reactions are not. You cannot arrest someone for looking startled. You cannot convict someone for having a private history. But you also cannot ignore that some reactions are louder than words. The police keep pressing politely, the way you do when you have nothing else. They ask about the book, about who she gave it to, about men she might have known, about any connection to the beach. She tells them what she tells them. Some of it is documented. Some of it is remembered through the fog of other people's notes. Cold cases are like that. The past is always being translated by tired hands. What matters in the shape of the case is that the woman becomes a node, a possible link between the dead man and a living world. And there is another person in that living world, a man the woman knew, someone she had given a rubaiyat to in earlier years. Police locate him. They ask questions. He is alive, and he is not the dead man. So that is another door that opens and does not lead where you want. It is not nothing, though. It tells you the woman did have a history of giving this book to someone. It tells you the rubaiyat was not an alien artifact dropped into the case by fate. It existed in local hands. Still, you keep circling the problem. How did the dead man's scrap get into his trousers? How did the book end up in a car? Why is there a phone number? Why are there letters that no one can solve? And why in the middle of all this can no one identify the body? You step back from the romance of it and return to the procedural grind, because that is where cases live, even famous ones. They review missing persons again. They compare dental records. Because teeth are stubborn, they check with other jurisdictions. They ask shipping companies and rail offices about travelers. They consider whether he might be from overseas. The man's appearance suggested to some he could be from Britain or elsewhere. But appearance is a liar. It is a story your brain tells itself based on haircuts and posture. You try to use the real clues. Clothing materials, stitching, laundry marks. In those days, people sometimes used dry cleaners that marked garments in specific ways. A tiny code of their own, stamped or written, that could point to a business. Investigators look for those marks. They chase them. Sometimes they find nothing. Sometimes they find a lead that ends in a shrug. And all the while, the body sits in its recorded stillness, refusing to become a person. This is the part of the case where the public starts building castles in the dark. The code becomes a cipher from intelligence services. The phone number becomes the address of a secret lover. The phrase becomes a suicide note with literary flair. And you keep your voice low, because the truth is slower and less satisfying. It is entirely possible the phrase meant nothing more than a book ending. It is entirely possible the code was a personal shorthand, not meant to be decrypted by anyone else. It is entirely possible the phone number was simply a contact, a friend, a nurse he once met, someone he wanted to call, or someone who once wrote their number down without knowing they would become famous for it. But possibility does not close cases. It just keeps them alive. You can feel Even in the way the documents are written, how the case becomes heavier, each new clue does not simplify. It multiplies. You also notice something else, the detail that tends to get smudged in retellings because it is not glamorous. The practical challenge of evidence preservation. In the late 1940s, forensic science exists, but it does not have the sleek, automated confidence of later decades. Samples degrade, paper gets handled, items get moved, notes get rewritten. A cold case is not just a mystery, it is an endurance test for paperwork. You imagine an evidence locker, metal shelves, brown envelopes, tags tied with string, the rubaiyat in a bag, the scrap of paper in another, the clothing folded in boxes. Each year that passes is another year that a label can peel, a record can be misplaced, a witness can die, a memory can soften at the edges, and yet the case persists. It persists because it is just strange enough to itch at people. It is a man with no name and a message that reads, "Finished." It persists because everyone has, somewhere in their private mind, a fear of being unrecognized, of leaving the world without anyone saying, "That was him, and he mattered." So the Somerton Man becomes a symbol, even as the investigators keep trying to treat him like a file. You follow the case into its next phase, the phase where the code becomes a hobby for strangers. People write letters to police. They propose solutions. They propose whole spy rings. Some of these letters are thoughtful, some are fever dreams. All of them take time to read. Detectives, real ones, have to do something with that. They cannot ignore it entirely because occasionally a civilian tip is the one good thread in a tangled mess. But they also cannot chase every theory because the world is full of theories and short on hours. So they triage, they check what they can, they file the rest. Meanwhile, the woman at the doorstep becomes, in the public imagination, a kind of keyhole. People want her to be the answer, because answers in true mysteries are often just people, affairs, jealousies, quiet betrayals, love that curdled into something else. But wanting does not make it so. And you have to be careful here, because the woman lived a life after that knock on the door, a life under a shadow she did not ask for. Whatever she knew or did not know, she became part of a legend that strangers felt entitled to rewrite. So you keep it restrained. You say only what the case gives you, that police traced a number to her, that she denied knowing the man, that her reaction was noted, and that decades of speculation grew in that gap between denial and expression. Gaps are where people build stories. The investigators also consider, in their more cynical moments, that the code might be a decoy, a distraction, something planted to waste time. Because that happens too. Criminals love a misdirection, so do people who think they are clever. But then you remember, the dead man could also have planted it himself. If he was ending his own life, he might have wanted the world to chase puzzles instead of asking the simple questions. Or he might have wanted, perversely, to be remembered. A man with no name still becomes famous if the mystery is good enough. And that is another grim truth. Sometimes anonymity is not hiding. Sometimes it is bait. You let the thought sit without forcing it to mean one thing. The autopsy details remain part of the background hum. Possible poisoning, no clear trauma, organs congested. Signs that could align with certain toxic substances that were hard to detect reliably then. especially if they metabolize quickly. It is not a neat medical conclusion. It is a medically educated shrug, which is infuriating because if you could prove poison, you could start narrowing suspects. Poison implies contact, access, intent. But the case refuses to hand you that. So you are left with this: a body without a name, a phrase without context, a code without a key, and a woman who might be connected or might simply be unlucky. And time, of course, keeps moving. The initial burst of investigation cools. Resources shift. Other cases happen. Crimes with clearer victims and clearer suspects demand attention. That is not callousness. That is triage. Somerton becomes one of those files that sits upright for a while, then slowly slouches as other folders lean against it. You can picture the moment it moves from active to cold. It is never announced with drama. It is a supervisor saying, "We have nothing new." It is a detective sighing and putting the file back. It is a clerk stamping something and moving on. But the case does not die. It just sleeps. And sleeping cases have a habit of waking up when someone new hears the story and thinks, surely we can solve that now. That happens in waves. Every few years, someone opens the drawer again. A journalist, a researcher, a retired detective with a long memory and a short tolerance for mystery. They reread the reports. They re-examine the photos. They talk to whoever is still alive. Each wave brings a little hope and a little distortion. Witnesses are older now. Their voices are thinner. Their recollections become less reliable, but more confident, because the mind hates uncertainty and fills gaps with whatever fits. A couple who saw a man on a beach becomes a couple who saw him move his arm. Then it becomes, they saw him look at them. Then it becomes, they saw someone else in the shadows. This is how stories grow horns. You, though, keep your hand on the facts. The Somerton Man case becomes famous for its unresolved identity and its strange literary clue. It becomes a kind of cultural riddle, and that is both good and bad. Good, because more eyes can mean more solutions. Bad, because more eyes can mean more noise. The code is reanalyzed. People bring newer cryptographic methods. They try to match the letter patterns to known texts. Some suggest it is an acrostic from the Rubaiyat itself. Some say it could be initials of sentences from a personal letter. Some say it is random. Randomness is always an option, and it is always unsatisfying. But randomness is also common. The world produces patterns even when no one is trying to. You can test that yourself anytime you like. Look at raindrops on a window. You will see faces. You will see letters. You will see meaning. The question is whether meaning was intended. There is also the human tendency to treat the dead man like a character, not a person. People argue about whether he was handsome, whether he looked foreign, whether he looked like someone who would carry poetry. Those are soft judgments. They are not evidence. They are just a way to feel close to the story. Real closeness would be knowing his name, and that, for decades, remains out of reach. Then the modern world arrives, slowly, like a new kind of dawn. New tools, new labs, new databases, new ways of reading old evidence. But before you get to the modern part, you have to sit with what time does to a case. Time does not just pass, it edits. It edits witnesses out of existence. It edits paper into brittle fragments. It edits institutional memory. So the detective who knew the file best retires, then dies, and the next person inherits a stack of notes without the context that made them make sense. It edits the physical world too. Streets change, buildings get renovated, records are lost in moves. A phone number becomes meaningless when exchanges change and directories get thrown away. Time is not neutral. It is an accomplice to mystery. So you watch the Somerton file age. It gets reopened, yes, but it also gets misfiled, resummarized, retold. Every retelling risks small errors, and small errors over decades become cliffs. Someone writes the wrong date, someone misreads a name, someone assumes a detail that was actually uncertain. And because the case is famous, those errors spread. They become part of the legend. People cite them as fact because someone else did first. You learn in your tired detective way to distrust the clean narrative. You prefer the ugly, original document, the first report, the early inventory, the initial witness statement before it had time to be polished into a story. The Somerton case has plenty of polish now. Too much, maybe. Still, the core remains stubborn. A man is dead, and the world cannot agree on who he was. And that is not just a puzzle. It is a kind of insult. It is what happens when a person slips through the cracks of bureaucracy, geography, and human attention. So when modern investigators and researchers come back to it, they come back with something different. They come back with the idea that identity can be rebuilt biologically, not from a wallet, not from a label, not from a witness, but from the quiet code inside the body itself. Deoxyribonucleic acid, DNA. It is a term that sounds clinical and futuristic, but it is really just the body's paperwork, a long chemical record of family. The thing that says, you came from somewhere, even if no one wrote it down. In the early days of the case, this was not available. You could not pull a family tree from a bone sample. You could not compare a stranger to distant relatives who had mailed saliva to a company for fun. But decades later, you can. You can, at least, try. And trying is what cold cases run on. So you imagine the careful process. Old evidence is retrieved. Samples are handled with gloves and caution. Because contamination is the enemy of truth. The lab work is slow and expensive. The results are uncertain. Sometimes you get nothing usable because time has eaten the sample. But sometimes you get enough to build a profile, enough to compare. And when you compare, you do not always get a direct hit. The man might not be in any database. If he lived quietly, if he never committed a crime, if he never served in a system that took his prints or his blood, then no file will pop up and say, that is him. Instead, you look sideways. You look for relatives. You look for partial matches, the genetic equivalent of a familiar face in a crowd, a second cousin, a third cousin, someone who shares just enough with the dead man to suggest a shared ancestor. This is where the work becomes oddly old-fashioned, because the science gives you a direction, but the rest is genealogy. Names on paper, birth records, marriage records, immigration documents, family stories. A modern detective becomes, temporarily, a historian with a badge. You trace branches, you circle names, You build charts that look like winter trees, bare and intricate, and you keep expectations gentle because even with DNA, nothing is guaranteed. Records can be missing. Families can be complicated. People can be adopted. Names can change. Fathers can be unknown. Lies can be baked into official history. But still, it is something. It is a new way to ask the old question: who was he? In the Somerton case, modern efforts have pointed toward candidate identities and toward family lines that may connect. The story has shifted in recent years, with researchers arguing for a likely name and for likely origins based on genetic genealogy. This is where you can feel the case wanting to close, wanting finally to become a person again. But you stay cautious because public claims and official conclusions are not always the same thing. A researcher can be confident and still be wrong. An institution can be slow and still be right. What matters in your steady late-night voice is the shape of the change. The Somerton Man is no longer trapped entirely in the 1940s. He is being pulled gently into the present by methods that did not exist when he died. It is both comforting and unsettling. Comforting because it suggests anonymity is not forever. Unsettling because it reminds you that the dead can be identified without their consent, their secrets opened by the living with enough funding and patience. The case, even now, still carries debates about what the DNA proves, about what it implies, about whether identification resolves the deeper mystery of how he died, and why he was there, and what Tamam Shud meant in his pocket, because a name is not the same as an answer. A name tells you who. It does not always tell you why. And why is the part that keeps you awake. You consider, too, that even if you solve his identity, you still have to solve the manner of death. Was it self-inflicted? Was it homicide? Was it some medical event that looked like poison? Because medicine was less precise then. The beach does not care. The ocean keeps moving. But you, cursed with curiosity, care. You care because if it was murder, someone got away with it, and not in a glamorous way, in the most insulting way, by leaving behind so little and letting time do the rest. If it was suicide, then the case becomes a different kind of tragedy. A man who wanted to vanish so completely that even his clothing labels were denied. And if it was accidental, then it becomes the darkest joke of all. A case inflated into myth because of a scrap of paper and a book left in a car. The truth can be banal. The truth can be cruel. The truth is often both. But the case has more human edges to explore before you drift fully into modern science. Because the trail to the woman's doorstep is not just a plot point. It is a reminder that this story happened in a real city, among real routines. So, you go back there again, softly, to that neighborhood. You imagine the woman after the police leave, the way she might sit alone with the shock settling in, the way she might replay her past, looking for the moment that could have led to this. Because even if she truly did not know him, she now has to live with the idea that her name, her number, her address was associated with a dead stranger. And if she did know him, if her denial was a choice, then she lived with something heavier, a secret that became a public carnival. People like to say, why did she not just tell them? As if telling is easy. As if telling does not ruin lives. As if telling does not invite suspicion, Headlines, shame, and the dull grind of being watched by strangers? You have seen witnesses keep quiet for smaller reasons: pride, fear, loyalty, the simple human urge to avoid trouble. So you let her remain what she is in the record: a possible connection, never fully resolved, a door the case knocked on and never quite entered. And that is the real texture of unsolved mysteries. Not monsters in alleys, not genius spies, just half-open doors and conversations that did not get written down properly, and emotions someone misinterpreted in a moment of pressure. Now you follow the case as it slips year by year into institutional sleep. The file is revisited. Evidence is checked. New detectives take a look and shake their heads at the old handwriting. They try to read the code again. They try to trace the book again. Sometimes they find something small, a new witness recollection, a newly noticed mark. Usually, they find the same wall. The case becomes part of police lore. It is the one you mention when you want to remind a rookie that not everything ties up. It is also the one that teaches a quieter lesson: that you can do everything right and still not get a clean answer. Because the world does not owe you closure, you can almost hear the metal drawer closing on the Somerton file. Not forever, but for now. The sound is soft, the kind of sound you could mistake for nothing if you were not listening. And then, as years go by, something else happens that always happens with famous mysteries. They get adopted. Not by family, not by friends, but by the public. By amateur sleuths. By writers. By people who cannot sleep and need a puzzle to chew on. They analyze the code. They analyze the paper. They analyze the posture on the beach. They argue about the meaning of the phrase "finished," as if language itself might confess if pressured hard enough. Some of them do good work. They compile records. They preserve documents. They push institutions to re-examine evidence. Some of them, frankly, just enjoy the feeling of being close to death without paying the cost. You do not judge too hard. You are here too in your own way. You are just trying to keep it honest and quiet and human, and honesty means admitting that for a long time, the Somerton Man stayed exactly what he was at the start. A question sitting upright against a wall, facing the ocean, as if listening to something the rest of us cannot hear. The case will keep shifting toward modern methods, toward genetic genealogy, toward new claims of identity. But before you get there completely, you let the older world linger a little longer. Because there is another detail in the old investigation that matters, not as a twist, but as a reminder of how fragile certainty is. The autopsy findings, the suggestion of poison, the absence of obvious struggle, all of it created a space where multiple realities could coexist. In one reality, he took something and chose this beach for his last view. In another, someone helped him die and arranged him like a scene. In another, he died of natural causes that looked suspicious because they were unexpected. And in all realities, the police were working with limited tools, under limited time, with the endless pressure of other cases. You see the detectives, in your mind, leaning over the evidence table again, late at night, coffee gone cold, eyes gritty. The letters from the code are copied out again, as if repetition might turn them into words. You see the scrap of tamam shud resting in its bag, tiny and smug. Two words that managed to outlive the man who carried them. You see the rubaiyat itself, worn at the edges, a book of poems turned into a forensic object. Its last page torn out like a tooth. And you understand, in a way that is almost soothing, why this case will never feel finished, even if someone eventually pins a name to the man. Because the mystery is not just identity. It is intention. It is why a human being ended up posed so neatly at the edge of the sea, with his labels removed and a book ending in his pocket. And the night likes questions like that. The night collects them. It will be a while before you can talk about DNA in a way that feels like progress. For now, you stay with the middle years, the long stretch where the case becomes a cold object in a warm world. You watch the file travel through decades, different hands, different priorities, different standards of record keeping. The case is revisited when someone finds a new angle, or when an anniversary brings journalists sniffing around again. And each revisit has the same problem. You cannot interrogate a beach. You cannot subpoena the past. You can only re-examine what was kept, and what was kept is always incomplete. That incompleteness is not malice. It is life. People lose things. Institutions move buildings. Evidence gets repackaged. Notes get summarized. The person who knew why a detail mattered retires. So, the Somerton Man becomes a case that teaches patience and humility. And the ugly truth that sometimes, despite your best effort, the dead remain strangers. Still, your mind keeps returning to that phrase, finished. If you wanted to leave a message, would you choose something that sounded like a closing line? If you wanted to hide a message, would you choose something that looked like a closing line? And if you were simply carrying a scrap from a book, a bookmark, a habit, would you ever imagine it would become your epitaph? The case keeps you in that slow orbit, and as you circle it, you begin to feel the edges of the next phase approaching, the modern phase, where science starts tugging at the threads time tried to bury. But you do not rush there yet. You let the old investigators have their last quiet moment with the tools they had: fingerprints, photographs, paper, shoe leather, a man with no name, and a book that refuses to behave like a book. And somewhere in that long stretch of years, while the Somerton file waits in its drawer, you can almost hear another drawer opening in a different room, in a different town. Because the night is full of unanswered cases, and they tend to keep each other company. The drawer that opens next is not magic, it is municipal. It smells like dust, carbon paper, and the kind of old glue that never quite dies. You pull the Somerton file back into the light, and you realize how cold cases really age. Not like wine, not like myths, but like receipts in a wallet. Creased, smudged, and somehow still accusatory. You start with what time always attacks first: context. Addresses change, businesses close, train lines reroute. The people who used to sit behind counters and remember faces are gone. Even the simplest lead, like a dry cleaner mark or a tailor's stitch pattern, becomes a dead language. You can still read the letters, you just cannot find anyone left to answer. And the case has letters. The code in the back of the rubaiyat keeps staring up at you like a bored student. You can feel the temptation to treat it like a sacred text, to imagine that if you just arrange it correctly, the dead man will finally speak. But you have lived in evidence rooms long enough to know a cruel truth. Most writing found near a body is not prophecy. It is habit. It is doodling. It is a reminder list. It is a human being trying to organize life the way you organize a kitchen drawer. Badly, and with mixed results. So you do the dull thing. You ask, what kind of person scribbles like that? You look at the pressure of the pencil, the spacing, the places where letters are crossed out. You imagine the hand, the wrist, the moment it was written. Was it quick, like someone copying down something they were told? Was it slow, like someone thinking, changing their mind, editing? Those crossed out letters matter because they suggest a mind that cares. Not necessarily a spy mind, just a mind that is trying to be accurate. And that brings you back, again, to the theme that never leaves this case: care, polished shoes, cut labels, a phrase tucked into a seam instead of tossed into a pocket. Even the way he was found, reclined, and quiet suggests someone wanted the world to see a finished picture. Time also attacks evidence in more literal ways. Paper yellows, ink fades, bags split at the seams. The wrong technician handles the wrong item without gloves. Because it is 1948 and nobody has been trained to fear skin cells the way we do now. And then there is the most boring killer of all, paperwork itself. You find references to exhibits that no longer exist. You find inventory lists that do not match other lists. You find measurements repeated slightly differently, like 3 people held the same object and disagreed about its shape. None of it feels dramatic. It feels like the world doing what it does, eroding certainty grain by grain. Meanwhile, the public keeps the story polished. The public does not sit with missing forms. The public sits with a dead man and a foreign phrase. So the legend grows while the file decays. You can see the waves of renewed interest in the margins of the record. A journalist calls, and suddenly, someone has to pull the evidence and confirm it still exists. A new detective inherits the case and writes a summary, trimming away awkward details that feel irrelevant, because summaries are what you do when you are drowning. A researcher comes in with a theory, confident, tidy, and wrong in at least one important way. That is not an insult. It is the natural outcome of looking at an incomplete puzzle and pretending you can see the whole picture. The Somerton Man becomes, for years, a case that lives in limbo, not solved, not abandoned, just stored. And in that storage, you start noticing something about how institutions behave. Police departments are built to handle emergencies, not long mysteries. They are good at running toward a scream. They are not always good at sitting quietly with a whisper for decades. So the file becomes a kind of orphan. It gets visits, but not a home. It gets attention, but not resolution. Sometimes you get these little moments in the record that feel almost tender. A detective writes that the body is still unidentified. Another one, years later, checks the fingerprints again, just in case a new comparison system exists now. Someone else rechecks missing persons lists because hope is cheap and the task is familiar. You picture them doing it late in the day when the office is thinning out, the sound of a fan turning, the stale smell of coffee, the faint clatter of paper being moved from one stack to another. And the case gives them nothing. That is what makes the modern shift feel so strange. Not exciting, strange. Because suddenly, the world invents a new way to ask old questions. Not because of romance, or poetry, or codes, but because of biology. You open the modern part of the file, and it feels like a different language. Labs, protocols, chain of custody forms that look more precise. People start talking about profiles, comparisons, and extraction. You still have to keep it simple because the process is both powerful and fragile. The idea is not complicated. Your cells carry a kind of inherited pattern. If you can get enough of that pattern from a person, you can compare it to patterns from other people. If you find a match, you find family. And if you find family, you can walk backward through records until the unknown becomes a likely someone. But there are always buts. Cold cases are built out of buts, but the sample has to exist. Bone, hair, tissue, something preserved well enough, but it has to be handled cleanly, or you end up comparing a detective's skin cells to a stranger's bones and congratulating yourself on solving nothing. But the databases do not contain everyone. They contain the people who were sampled, or the people whose relatives were sampled. And even if you find family, families are complicated. Names change. People disappear on purpose. Someone's father is not who the paperwork says it is. Someone is adopted and never told. The family tree turns out to be more like a vine. Still, modern investigators and researchers try, because trying is what humans do when a question has stared at them long enough. You imagine the lab, not glamorous, just bright and controlled. The hum of equipment, the careful opening of old packaging, the quiet seriousness of someone holding a tiny piece of the past, knowing one sneeze could ruin it. They build what they can, a profile, not a full biography, not a confession, just a biological outline. Then comes the part that always sounds quaint, despite being modern: genealogy, the slow crawl through birth certificates, marriage licenses, immigration records, cemetery listings. Names written in tidy cursive, sometimes misspelled, sometimes changed, midlife like a coat. You end up with candidate lines, candidate identities. People start making arguments. One name begins to float to the surface in recent years, supported by genetic genealogy work and further research. A likely identity proposed for the Somerton Man. You do not treat it like a grand reveal. You treat it like what it is: a serious, evidence-driven attempt to put a real name to a real body. And even if that name is correct, you still have the rest of the mystery sitting there like an unwashed dish. How did he die? Why was he on that beach? Why the removed labels? Why the rubaiyat? Why the torn phrase? Why the code? Why the phone number? Identification is a door, not a room. You can walk through it and still find yourself in darkness. You also notice, in the modern discussion, a quiet tension that always shows up when science meets myth. People want the DNA to solve everything. They want it to point directly at a killer, a motive, a clandestine job, a secret romance. But DNA does not tell you who loved you or who hated you. It does not tell you who you met in a dim street and trusted too much. It does not tell you whether you swallowed poison on purpose or by mistake. It just tells you, very calmly, you belong to a family whether you wanted to or not. And that brings you back to the human part again. Because if the Somerton Man had family and the modern world can trace them, then somewhere there are people who have to decide what to do with that knowledge. Imagine it. You are living an ordinary life, bills and chores and weather, and then a phone call tells you a distant relative might be a dead man found on a beach in 1948, a man you never met who has been a public puzzle for decades. Congratulations, you are now related to a headline. That is not closure. That is inheritance. You sit with the idea that some mysteries once solved simply relocate their discomfort. The discomfort moves from the police file to the family table, from an evidence room to a living room. And it is not just emotional, it is practical. If the identity is confirmed, it raises questions about records, burial, and history. It raises questions about whether the story that grew around him was fair. It raises questions about what he might have wanted. But wanting, as always, is not evidence. So you keep the focus on the method. Modern tools can narrow the unknown. They can connect a body to a family tree. They can give investigators a better starting point than a cut clothing label. Yet the case still contains that original, stubborn fog. Because even if you know his name, you still have to explain the scene. And the scene was arranged. You go back mentally to that seawall again. That line between sand and stone. A place where people sit to watch waves, or to wait for someone, or to smoke a cigarette and pretend they are thinking. He was dressed for something else. That part is hard to shake. A neat suit at the beach is either a man coming from somewhere formal, or a man trying to look formal, or a man who does not own casual clothing. Each explanation is possible. None of them is satisfying. You think about poison again, because poison is the kind of murder people choose when they want the body to argue quietly. Poison does not leave obvious bruises. Poison can be mistaken for illness. Poison lets the killer walk away before the victim even knows they are dying. But poison is also the kind of death that can happen accidentally. A wrong dose, a bad mix, a mislabeled bottle, a habit that turns on you. And poison is hard to prove after the fact, especially in that era. Some substances disappear from the body quickly. Some become indistinguishable from natural breakdown. The old reports describe findings that can align with poisoning, but do not lock it down. That medical uncertainty becomes part of the case's permanent architecture. Then there is the possibility that always lurks behind tidy mysteries, that the story is less clever than it looks. Maybe the labels were removed because he did not want to be identified after a suicide. That is plausible. People do it. Not often, but enough. Maybe the Rubaiyat was simply his book, and the torn phrase was a personal bookmark. People tear scraps from books all the time. It is a rude habit, but common. Maybe the code was personal shorthand, meaningful only to him. Maybe the woman's number was just a number. Maybe she was a nurse who helped him once, or someone he met briefly, or someone whose details he carried without her knowing. The problem is, each maybe leaves you with the same ending. A man dead on a beach and no one stepping forward to claim him. That is why the case never feels finished, no matter what you solve. It is the loneliness of it, the administrative loneliness. A human being becoming municipal responsibility. You keep reading the old documents and you notice how the language changes over time. Early reports are plain. Later summaries start to sound slightly mythic, even in official tone. That is what fame does. It bends reality a little toward narrative. Even investigators are not immune. They are human. They want meaning too. They want to feel like their work connects to something larger than forms and evidence tags. And then you reach the point in the story where the Somerton Man, for the purposes of a late-night mind, settles back into his chair against the seawall. He remains a question, even with modern tools tugging at him. So the night does what it always does. It wanders. It looks for other files with similar shapes, other quiet mysteries, other ordinary moments that turned into permanent unknowns. Because the world has more than one Somerton Man, it just has fewer headlines. So you let the case drift outward, gently, into a small anthology of other unsolved stories. Stories that do not need gore to be unsettling. Stories built out of absence, timing, and one stubborn object left behind. You start in a place that smells like pine and cold metal. A parking lot at the edge of wilderness where the air is so clean it feels sharp. You are looking at a car that has been sitting too long. Dust gathered in the corners, like the vehicle itself is trying to become part of the landscape. This is the kind of scene you get with missing persons cases. Not a body, not a struggle, just a stopped story. A person drove here, a person parked, and then the person vanished into a world that does not keep receipts. You read the notes and you feel the familiar pattern. Someone last seen on an ordinary day. Someone with an ordinary plan. A hike, a quick errand, a short drive. The kind of thing nobody announces like it matters. Then the clock starts doing its cruel work. Hours become a day. A day becomes worry. Worry becomes search parties. Search parties become grids and maps and boots on the ground. You become the investigator walking those search lines. You hear your own footsteps in leaves. You hear radios crackle with small updates. Nothing found, no sign, no trace, and you learn again what nature does to evidence. It eats it, it buries it, it scatters it. In cities, the ground holds secrets in concrete and walls. In wilderness, the ground simply absorbs. Sometimes the missing are found quickly. Sometimes they are found years later, a bone caught in a root system, clothing turned to rags, the explanation reduced to physics and bad luck. But in the unsolved ones, you get the most maddening possibility of all, that someone chose to disappear. Not kidnapped, not lost, not dead in a ravine, just gone. And that possibility turns every small detail into a potential confession. A wallet left behind, a phone left on a seat, a jacket folded too neatly. It starts to feel staged, even when it might not be. You look at the abandoned object because abandoned objects are the anchor points of mystery. The Somerton Man had his book and his scrap. The missing hiker has a car and a set of keys. A different case might have a suitcase by a highway or a bicycle leaning against a fence. Each one whispers the same thing. Someone was here, then they were not. Now you shift softly to another kind of unsolved story, one that takes place not in wilderness, but in the most domestic trap of all, a quiet house at night. You know the kind of neighborhood. Lawns trimmed, streetlights humming, curtains drawn. The world looks safe enough that you let your guard down without noticing. That is always the first mistake, and it is always understandable. A person goes to bed. The house settles. Pipes click. A refrigerator cycles on. Ordinary noises, the kind you stop hearing once you live somewhere long enough. Then, somewhere in the night, one sound arrives. that does not belong. A door that should not open, a floorboard that should not creak, a soft impact like a hand on a wall. In many cases, that sound leads to something explainable. A cat, a neighbor, a branch. But in some cases, the sound is the hinge of a disappearance. A person is seen one day, then never again. A bed is slept in, then never slept in again. No blood, no note, no confirmed exit. You are left investigating a life from the inside out. You open drawers, you look at toothbrushes, you check whether clothes are missing, whether shoes are gone, whether a passport is still in the same place. Those are the details that matter, and they are unglamorous. A missing coat can mean someone left in a hurry, or it can mean laundry day. A missing wallet can mean a planned trip, or a robbery, or a person who always kept it in their pocket. Every domestic object becomes ambiguous when the owner is not there to explain it. And this is where you get the same problem that haunted Somerton: the gap between evidence and interpretation. Investigators do what they can. They check last phone calls, they check neighbors, they check whether anyone saw a vehicle, they check whether someone's bank account was used. But sometimes the only answer the world gives you is silence, the long, bureaucratic kind. You sit in an interview room with someone who knew the missing person, a spouse, a roommate, a friend. They say the right things, or they say the wrong things, or they say nothing useful, because grief makes memory unreliable. You have to measure their words against their behavior, and that is always unfair. People react strangely to shock. Some laugh, some freeze, some speak too much, some speak too little. You cannot solve a case by judging emotions. You can only use emotions as a signal, a hint that something is happening underneath the story, and hints are not proof. Now you let the anthology drift again to a case shaped by one of the simplest, most haunting modern objects, a phone that never rings again. You hold the phone in your mind, not physically, just as an idea, a device that is supposed to locate you, connect you, record you. It feels impossible now to vanish completely, but people still do. They just do it in different ways. The phone is found somewhere it should not be, in a ditch, in a park, in a trash bin. Sometimes broken, sometimes intact, like it was placed there carefully. You imagine an investigator lifting it with gloves, because everything is evidence now, even the smudges of a fingertip. They try to pull data. They try to read location history. They try to reconstruct movement through cell towers and pings. And then, sometimes, the phone tells you nothing. Or it tells you a story that ends abruptly. A last message, a final call, a battery that died at the worst moment. Technology makes us feel safer, but it also gives us new ways to misunderstand. A missing person case becomes an argument about whether a phone shutting off was accidental or deliberate. Congratulations, you are now interrogating a rectangle of glass. In unsolved cases, that is what you do. You interrogate objects because people are no longer available. And the objects, like the Somerton Man's scrap of paper, keep their secrets by being simple. A phone is not a witness. It is a tool that records only certain kinds of truth. If someone leaves their phone behind on purpose, the phone becomes a decoy. If someone's phone is taken by someone else, the phone becomes a liar. If someone's phone falls into water, the phone becomes a dead fish. So you return always to the quiet details around it, the last place the person was seen, the timing, the habits. Were they the kind of person who always charged their phone? Were they the kind of person who never left home without it? Did they have a reason to walk away from it? A person's habits are sometimes more reliable than a device. Sometimes. You let another story slide into view, one that fits the same soft shape as Somerton, a body, or a disappearance that comes with an object that feels like a message. A note, for example, left in a car. Not a dramatic suicide letter, not a confession, just a few lines that could mean anything. I will be back soon, gone for a walk. Do not worry. Those are the phrases that sound comforting until they become permanent. You are reading them under the wrong circumstances, and you can feel the meaning change. The ink becomes heavier. The casual tone becomes eerie. The handwriting becomes a kind of ghost. You investigate the note like it is a physical thing, because it is. You check for fingerprints. You check for indentations, because paper remembers pressure even when ink does not. You check what kind of pen was used. You check whether the paper came from a pad in the house. You do all of that because you want to know a simple thing. Did the missing person write it? Or did someone else? Most people watching crime stories forget how often you have to answer that question. Did they write it? Did they send it? Did they mean it? It is the difference between a person choosing to disappear and a person being erased by someone else. And sometimes you cannot tell. Sometimes the note is too generic. Sometimes the handwriting is too common. Sometimes the paper has been handled by too many well-meaning hands. Then you are back where you started, a quiet object and a loud absence. You keep the pace steady because this is not about jolts. It is about patterns. And the pattern is this: mysteries survive in the ordinary. A man sits on a beach. A book lies in a car. A code sits in a back cover. A phone rests in grass. A note waits on a table. Nothing explodes. Nobody screams on cue. The world remains calm enough that people assume everything will be fine. And then time passes, and the calm becomes suspicious. You can feel your mind trying to connect these stories like constellations. That is what humans do. We take scattered lights and draw animals between them. But the truth is simpler and more grim. Unsolved cases often remain unsolved because the crucial moment was small. A 10-second window when someone could have noticed something but did not. A minor decision, like not calling the police because you did not want to bother anyone. A record not kept. A sample not preserved. A witness who moved away. Mystery is often just logistics. So you drift back briefly to Somerton with that in mind, because it helps you understand why the code and the book and the phrase became so powerful. They are small things that survived. In a case full of lost context, the surviving objects become idols. You picture the tiny scrap again, sealed in plastic. 2 words that made people treat the death like a riddle. It is almost unfair to the dead man. In a way, he might have been ordinary. He might have been unhappy. He might have been sick. He might have been involved in something secret. Yes, but he also might have just been a person who liked a book. And the book, the Rubaiyat, is the kind of book that invites projection. It is full of lines about fate and endings and the thinness of life. People read it and feel clever or doomed or romantic. It is an easy companion for someone who feels like they do not belong. So if the Somerton Man carried it, it tells you something not about spies necessarily, but about mood, about the kind of thoughts that might keep someone awake at night. And if he did not carry it, if the book was planted, then it tells you something else about someone who wanted investigators to chase poetry instead of people. Either way, the object does its job. It distracts, it fascinates, it survives. Now, you let the anthology continue, one more quiet porch light of a case drifting past. A case where the last known moment is almost boring. A person is seen walking down a street, not running, not distressed, just walking. They wave at someone. They carry something ordinary, a bag, a jacket, a book. The witness later says, "Nothing seemed wrong." That is always the phrase. Nothing seemed wrong. Then the person turns a corner, or steps into a building, or leaves a bus, and they are never seen again. You investigate the route. You stand where the witness stood. You look down the street and realize how many places a person can vanish into, even in daylight. Doorways, alleys, cars pulling up for a moment, construction sites, public bathrooms, stairwells. Cities are full of small pockets where time goes unrecorded. You check cameras, if they exist. In older cases, they do not. In newer cases, they do, but the footage is grainy, overwritten, blocked by a pole, or simply not pointing where you need it. You knock on doors. You ask if anyone heard anything. Most people did not. Or they did, but they assumed it was nothing. A shout, a car door, a thud. The city has 1,000 thuds per hour, and you cannot chase them all. Again, mystery is often just timing. Somebody had a window, a minute, maybe two, and that was enough. By the time police are notified, the world has already moved. Cars have driven, people have walked, weather has shifted. Evidence that might have mattered is already smeared into normalcy. That is when the case starts to resemble Somerton, not in details, but in shape. An absence that should have been filled by a name, a witness, a record, and was not. Now, you slow down on the shared truth, because it is the real connective tissue here. Not spies, not romance, not codes. The shared truth is that we live most of our lives unobserved. And when something goes wrong in an unobserved moment, the world later has to reconstruct it with crumbs. You, as the investigator, become a person who reads crumbs. A torn paper edge, a ticket unused, a label cut out, a phone left behind, a neighbor who remembers a car that might have been blue or might have been green. And you build the best story you can. Then you test it until it breaks. That is the job. That is the grind. The public wants the story that does not break. The story with a villain and a motive and a clean ending. But the real world does not care what the public wants. The real world cares what can be proven. So many cases remain unsolved because proof is a higher standard than belief. You can believe the Somerton Man was a spy. It is a fun belief. It fits the era. It matches the missing labels and the code and the foreign phrase. It makes the world feel cinematic. Proving it is another matter. Proving it would require records that intelligence services do not like to share, or witnesses who never existed on paper, or a confession from someone long dead. You can also believe he died by suicide, staging his own anonymity like a last act of control. Proving that is also hard. A body does not sign a statement. A poison does not always leave a receipt. And the mind of a dead stranger remains private unless it left something more direct than 2 words torn from a book. So, you live in the middle. That is where investigators live. You live with probability, and with incomplete certainty, and with the quiet frustration of doing your best and still not knowing. And eventually, if you do this long enough, you learn something that almost sounds like comfort. Not knowing is not failure every time. Sometimes it is just the honest outcome of limited information. Sometimes the world really does leave you with an unfinished file. You sit with that idea now because the night likes it. The night is full of unfinished things, half-remembered dreams, unanswered messages, thoughts that start and trail off. An unsolved case is just the darkest version of that human experience. You picture the Somerton evidence again in its bags, the scrap, the book, the clothing, each item quiet, each item waiting for the right person, the right technique, the right stroke of dull luck. The waves on Somerton Beach keep repeating themselves in the background of your mind, because repetition is what nature does when it does not have answers. And you understand why people keep returning to the story, not because they love death, but because they hate loose ends. They want the world to behave like a storybook, with a last page that says, "Finished." Tamam shud. But life does not always print that phrase where you can see it. Sometimes it tears the page out and hides it in a seam. You keep the thought there, hanging, because there is more to drift through, more quiet mysteries, more small objects that became heavy. And as you move from file to file, you can feel that same slow question following you like footsteps in an empty hallway. If a person can vanish or die unnamed, what does it take to bring them back into focus? Sometimes it takes science. Sometimes it takes a witness finally speaking. Sometimes it takes a bored clerk years later opening the right box and noticing one detail that did not fit. And sometimes